Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. This evening's event is part of the Intermarium Lecture Series sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. This evening, we'll be hearing from Mr. Andrew Kavchik. Mr. Kavchik was born in Montreal. He studied political science and law. He spent his career in the Canadian Federal Civil Service, mostly working in policy units with the Departments of Revenue, Industry, and International Trade. Since retiring, he has pursued his hobbies of reading and writing about history. Mr. Kavchik has written and published several books that are available on Amazon, including Remembering Guzhenko, The Struggle to Honor a Cold War Hero, and the Katyn Forest Massacre, an annotated bibliography of books in English. He currently lives in Ottawa, Canada. Mr. Kavchik, welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Hannah. I'd like to thank the Institute of World Politics for giving me the honor and privilege of speaking to you today. And I'd like to specifically thank Professor Marek Chodakiewicz for the invitation. I'd also like to thank Katie Stoffley and Hannah McGann, whom we just heard, who also helped make this event possible. So my topic for discussion today is this book that I recently wrote and published titled The Katyn Forest Massacre, an Annotated Bibliography of Books in English. It's about 238 pages long. It's available on Amazon, and it's, I hope, a text that will be of use for future students of the Katyn Forest Massacre, and something that may in the future be subsequently updated by future historians. So first, what I'd like to do is give you an idea of what prompted me to write the book and how the book came about, and then I'll provide an overview of the book and its contents. So my basic interest stemmed from a personal family history. My grandfather, Stanisław Kavchik, and this is a picture of him from just before the war. He fought in World War I. He fought as an officer in the Polish Bolshevik War of 1919-1920. Between the wars, he was a lawyer in Warsaw, mobilized on the eve of World War II as an officer. Well, at the beginning of the war, he fought in the battle on the defense of Brest on the Bug River, was captured by the Soviets. And in the end of 1939, my grandmother and my father received this postcard. It's a postcard that has imprinted on it the emblem of a hammer and sickle and Soviet or Russian lettering. And I found it in our family sort of files, and I immediately recognized from the date, November 30th, 1939, that this was the first of 2 postcards my grandfather sent from the Starobielsk camp to his wife. The second one, unfortunately, I was unable to find. But my father tells me that after this first one was received and they knew that my grandfather was alive and that he was at the Starobielsk camp, the second card they received apparently in early 1940 said that he had received nothing yet, no correspondence from his wife. And whatever was sent obviously wasn't being delivered, and then eventually the correspondence came back with a note saying the addressee had left. So when I was a child, my father made it very clear to me that Katyn had affected our family, and my father had several books about Katyn at home, but as a youngster, I didn't find reading those books particularly enjoyable. I didn't understand much of the history and all the references to persons, places, and events. And I figured one of these days I'll delve into it. And a couple of years ago, I came across this book. This was a book written by Zdzisław Jagodziński. It's the Katyn Bibliography. Now, it's a pretty thin one here. It was first published in 1976. It was 16 pages. This edition is the 1982 edition, which is 48 pages. And Zdzisław Jagodziński was a Pole who survived deportation to the Soviet Union, ended up in London after the war, became a librarian. And this bibliography lists many of the books that had been published about Katyn, but it's not annotated, and it's also books in multiple languages. So the thing is, there's not a lot of English books, but there's also a lot of Polish, German, some Italian, some Dutch, French. And this sort of prompted me to think that maybe the time had come 38 years later to update this with an annotation strictly about books in English. Now, a couple of years ago, I finally got down to reading the books that my father had on our family bookshelf, and I started buying some more, which was, I was very lucky with this internet these days. It's possible to get out of print books through used bookstores anywhere on the planet. And eventually I collected over 38 books that I determined were contributing enough to the Katyn story that they're worth documenting. So what I'd like to do now is describe the book and the contents. So the first chapter provides the reader with an overview history of the Katyn Forest Massacre. And I think this is necessary because although many of the older generation of Poles are thoroughly familiar with it, it's obvious that the younger generation is sometimes a little missing some of the facts, and of course, those who aren't Poles very rarely are in fact familiar with the details. So the discussion, the purpose of a general overview there is to sort of set the context to help understand the meaning and the contribution that the subsequent books that are discussed contribute. Then I have a short chapter where I try to assess the nature of the literature overall and the various groupings under which one can, assemble various types of books that have been written about Katyn. And then I proceed with a chapter by chapter discussion. They're all short chapters with two parts. The first trying to provide some background about the authors, and the second part being a sort of a summary with some anecdotes or stories from the book and discussion of what it contributes to the overall knowledge of the Katyn Forest Massacre. So with that in mind, I'd like to sort of replicate the book in this webinar, and obviously with the 45 minutes or so that I have remaining, I'll have to really cut things short. And it occurred to me that this is going to be like a sort of a version of speed dating with a review of books. And given the increased prevalence of attention deficit disorder in our society, it occurred to me that that would probably be an appealing format for a few potential viewers. So very quickly then, the Katyn Forest Massacre, what happened? In September of 1939, the Germans invaded Poland from the west. The Soviets, pursuant to the August 23rd agreement they had with the Nazis, invaded from the east and partitioned Poland between them according to the spheres of influence that they had previously agreed upon. The Soviets ended up, in fact, occupying more Polish territory than the Nazis did. When the Soviets invaded eastern Poland, they captured approximately 250,000 Polish soldiers. They segregated 10,000 Polish officers and had them interned in several camps. One was Starobielsk, which was the one where my grandfather was. Another one was, and by the way, Starobielsk is in what is now in Ukraine, not far from Kharkov. The second one was Kozielsk in Russia, not far from Smolensk. And the third, which is where they were mostly border guards and policemen and landowners, was Ostashkov, which was near Kalinin, which is known today as Tver. So the 10,000 Polish officers were at Starobielsk and Kozielsk, but all in all, there were 15,000 at these three camps. And they weren't allowed at first to write to their families, but then they were. Like I said, my family got 2 cards, but one of the benefits of sending these cards, allowing the inmates to send cards to their families, was that the NKVD was able to then get the addresses of the families. And the Soviets, between 1939 and 1941, undertook 4 waves of mass under midnight arrests and deportations of Poles to Kazakhstan and Siberia for purposes of hard labor. And the correspondence with the addresses of the families provided the Soviets with the addresses where they could arrest these families. And I think these deportations are part and parcel of the whole Kremlin approach and policies with regard to dealing with the Polish population. And I don't think that one can really divide or separate the Katyn affair as a sort of a standalone event. It was all interconnected. So my family was lucky in the sense that they were not arrested and deported to Siberia because they had, ironically, the good fortune of living in the Nazi zone of occupation. While the inmates were at the camps, of course, they were interrogated, and in early March 1940, NKVD Chief Beria provided a memo to Stalin and the Politburo indicating that these Polish officers were all anti-Soviet, and he recommended shooting. The Politburo agreed. The memo was signed by Stalin and his colleagues. And in April and in May of 1940, all of these Polish officers, as well as prisoners from various prisons in Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, were executed. In the 3 camps, they were all taken to nearby buildings of the NKVD and executed, or at the Katyn Forest, near the forest, and then their bodies were dumped in mass graves. Those from Starobielsk murdered in Kharkov and buried in mass graves outside of the city of Czapski. Those from Kozielsk were buried in the Katyn Forest, and those from Ostashkov were buried in Midnoye. So there were, however, 400 in total from the 3 camps, Polish officers and prisoners who were not executed. These were saved, effectively becoming survivors who were sent to another camp called Gryazowiec. The question of why still seems to be a little bit open to debate. It's known that at least 50 of them were communists, and it's suspected that the rest were perceived by the Soviets as being potentially useful, although many of them turned out to be just as patriotic as their comrades who'd been executed. So everything changed, of course, in June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans unleashed Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. Suddenly we were in the same camp with the Soviets in a common struggle against Hitler. The Polish government in exile signed an agreement with the Soviet ambassador. It became the Sikorsky-Mayski Agreement, which provided for the release of Polish prisoners in the Soviet Union under the guise of an amnesty, and it provided for the creation of a Polish army on Soviet territory under the leadership of General Anders. That army ended up leaving the Soviet Union in 1942 to Persia, and eventually went on to Palestine and achieving glory in the Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944 in Italy. But while they were forming in the Soviet Union in late 1941, the question was, well, where are the officers? And all of their requests to the Soviets had been dodged. And eventually, in April of 43, their suspicions were borne out with the Nazi discovery in the Katyn Forest of a mass grave containing some 4,400 corpses of the prisoners who were held at the Kozielsk camp. So the Germans immediately had a medical commission of their own hosting the place. They brought in an international group to carry out exhumations and autopsies to try to determine when were these soldiers killed. And the Polish Red Cross also was participating in going through the pockets of the uniforms to try to identify the corpses. At the time, the Poles requested from the Polish government in exile the International Red Cross to investigate. The Soviets refused to let them on Soviet territory for purposes of such an investigation, and Stalin used that event as a pretext to break off relations with the Polish government in exile. And this is a real good example of realpolitik, so to speak, which is the system by which politics and principles based on practical rather than moral or ideological considerations govern behavior. Here, the British and the Americans essentially saw the Soviets as more useful than the Poles in terms of the fight against Hitler, and so Polish concerns were largely marginalized. Now, in late 1943, the Soviets took over the Katyn region. They always insisted that from the discovery of the graves that the Nazis had committed this crime. They set up their own fraudulent commission called the Budenko Commission that reported in January of 1944 saying that these Poles had been killed by the Nazis in the fall of 1941, which of course was formally the Soviet Katyn lie that persisted until 1990. In the 1946 Nuremberg war crimes trials, the Soviets initially included in the charges against the Germans the commission of the war crime at Katyn, but after some testimony, they dropped it. It became kind of obvious that they couldn't prove that it was a German crime. So the Nuremberg trial was ended without any determination or declaration as to guilt with regard to the Katyn crime. The Soviets finally in 1990, Gorbachev admitted that there was a crime committed by the NKVD. And in 1992, Russian President Yeltsin released the copy of the execution order signed by Stalin himself. The Soviets and the Russians had initiated some investigations, but these went nowhere. And in 2000, Polish military cemeteries were opened at the 3 mass grave sites. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the history of the Katyn Forest Massacre. And the literature overview that I provide groups the literature into these categories. The first is overview studies that had been published before 1990 and the Soviet admission of guilt, and then those that were published after. There's also a section dealing with political memoirs by politicians, diplomats, and generals, and a section dealing with memoirs of the former prisoners, a section dealing with witnesses to the exhumations, both the ones done by the Germans and the Soviets. Then one section dealing with aerial photography, another with the experiences of the families, and one unique work of popular history, and a final grouping that I sort of make a miscellaneous interpretations, explanations, and remembrance. And one thing I wanted to say is that there are several books in English that are distortions or, in fact, complete denials and falsifications. I don't make any reference to any of these books in my book. I've decided also not to have any reference to any fiction. This book is entirely nonfiction. So, in terms of the overview of the books themselves, this I'm going to have to speed up a little bit, and I might end up dropping the last section if I go into overtime. First off the bat, there is 1951, the first overview book published about the history of the Katyn Massacre is Józef Mackiewicz's The Katyn Wood Murder. Now, he was, in fact, a journalist who had been sent by the Germans to the Katyn site during the exhumations and was expected to engage in anti-Bolshevik Nazi propaganda afterwards. And this book that he wrote that was published first in I think it was German in 1949 out of Switzerland, and now this English version basically reviewed all of the evidence that had been gathered and was available at that time. And there's a couple of points that are made and repeated throughout the other books that I'm going to refer to in a few moments. Some of the evidence was that, first of all, the Soviet pronouncements were always inconsistent, from the time that the prisoners disappeared, and then after the Germans discovered Katyn and so on, the stories about what happened to them were always changing, and so there was something suspicious about their behavior. The fact that all correspondence to all family members stopped at the same time after March of 1940. The documentation on the bodies that were exhumed all stopped at the same time in April of 1940. The soldiers were wearing cold weather clothing, which suggested that they were buried in colder spring weather rather than late summer weather. There were bayonet marks on the bodies from, the Soviets sometimes assumed those, all of them were executed by being shot in the back of the head. However, some had these bayonet marks suggesting that there was a struggle, and the Soviet bayonets had a four-corner edge as opposed to the German flat blade. Then the medical specialist determined that the degree of calcification inside the skulls could have only happened after 3 years, not 2 years as the Soviets were insisting. There were no insects in the graves, suggesting they were buried in colder weather. Hands were tied with rope, and the rope was Russian rope. And then on top of it all, there were younger trees that were planted over the mass graves, as opposed to the trees beyond and around the graves. So these were some of the cumulative facts that always pointed to guilt towards the Soviets. Now, one of the things that Mackiewicz says in his book, which is fascinating, is that newspapers were extremely useful to the soldiers. Besides being able to fold them to, wrap things, they could roll cigarettes with them, or they could use them as additional insulation in their socks and so on. And he said that at the exhumation, there were newspapers all over the place, but none of them were past March of 1940. And he said, and he quotes, which means there can be no doubt. Because if they were they were buried in 1941, why would they still have newspapers from over a year earlier? Now, his book doesn't have any concluding chapter. He leaves it to the reader to draw their own conclusion. Now, the next thing is the Madden Committee. This was a committee of the Congress that was formed in 1951, and it held hearings in Washington, Chicago, London, Berlin, Frankfurt, Naples. They heard over 103 witnesses. This was a truly comprehensive investigation, which resulted in some 2,679 pages in 7 volumes of information about Katyn. Now, those are in libraries, but fortunately, there's this one organization called Classic Reprint Series, which is reprinting some of these volumes. And so it's possible to get some of this, which is extremely, detailed, useful, and probably the most comprehensive study of its nature that had ever been done. Now, it concluded in an interim report that beyond any doubt, the NKVD was responsible for the crime. But the final report had something interesting, which I'll just read here. The final report said, in submitting this final report to the House of Representatives, this committee has come to the conclusion that in those fateful days nearing the end of the Second World War, there unfortunately existed in high governmental and military circles a strange psychosis that military necessity required the sacrifice of loyal allies and our own principles in order to keep Soviet Russia from making a separate peace with the Nazis. For reasons less clear to this committee, this psychosis continued even after the conclusion of the war. So this was another one of these important documents. The third in this category is this classic by Janusz Zawodny, which was published in 1962. It's a scholarly assessment of the situation. He reviews all of the evidence available and the positions of all the governments involved to that period. And he concludes by rejecting the idea that the Nazis committed the crime and comes to the conclusion that the NKVD did it in accordance with direction from the central government. Now, the next thing that's crucial in this category is this 1965 English book titled The Crime of Katyn, Facts and Documents. Now, it's not indicating who the author is, but it is published by the Polish Cultural Foundation in London. Now, in fact, this book lists all of the available relevant information and data and evidence about what happened at Katyn, but it has a very interesting history because the Anders army, when it was formed, created a documentation center, and they tried to accumulate all the information possible about what happened. And out of that documentation center, they published a number of booklets, but there were also a number of very important reports that came out. One was this one. I've got this electronic one that I printed off here it was compiled by Victor Suganitsky. It's called Facts and Documents Concerning Polish Prisoners of War Captured by the USSR During the 1939 campaign. But it's specifically listed as being for private circulation only. This was published in 1946, and it was in English. A Polish version was put together under a team led by Zdzisław Stal, which was published in 1948. And it's this translation of that document that was published in 1965. It's got a introduction, a preface by General Anders from the 1948 version and the 1965 version. This document didn't provide a sort of conclusion, but left the reader to decide based on the facts who they thought was responsible. And it was hoped after the Nuremberg trials that this would appeal to the conscience of the world and to international justice. There were several books by this one British author by the name of Louis FitzGibbon. He wrote in the 1970s a number of books, including this one, A Crime Without Parallel, which basically draws on the other books that had been published. And it resulted in quite a lot of public awareness in England, and letters to the editors, that kind of thing. As well as, at the time, the 30-year rule kicked in, which allowed for the release of previously confidential documents. So Louis FitzGibbon followed up with another one called the Katyn Cover-Up, and that was followed up with another one called Unpitied and Unknown. And in this book, one of the things that he does, besides copying much of the transcripts from the Madden committee hearings, is he also transcribes many pages from the Nuremberg trials, which I haven't seen in any other book. So this was actually a very interesting contribution. And one of the last ones published before the 1990 Soviet admission of guilt was this book by John Lauck, A-L-A-U-C-K, called Katyn Killings in the Record. And what he does here in two parts. The first part is he summarizes very well what was the history of the Katyn Massacre. And then in the second part, he summarizes the testimony that was given at the Madden committee. So for those researchers who are unable to access the 7 volumes in any library, this is a very useful text because it provides these one-page summaries of what each one of the 103 witnesses testified before the committee, which is very, very useful. Now, the second grouping, of course, is the overview studies that were published after the Soviet and the Russian admission. And in this section, there's a number of books that are truly classics and very important. The first, this one by George Sanford, Katyn and the Soviet Massacre of 1940, which was published in 2005. George Sanford was a British academic from the University of Bristol who wrote, in fact, in the book that his father was a Polish World War II vintage. Now, this is a complete history of relevant information about Katyn from before, during, and after, how the matter was covered up and how it was managed by all the parties, including the Soviets. To me, the most interesting thing when I was reading this was a chapter dealing with the details of the actual massacre and the machinery and the technology that the Soviets, how they carried it out. And it included also the names of the killers. I never thought that I would ever read this, but when I came across it, I was absolutely spellbound. And of course, one of the killers that he identifies, Vasily Blokhin, was responsible for the murder, the executions of the 7,000 prisoners from the Ostashkov camp, who was responsible for killing these poor victims for 28 consecutive nights to kill 7,000 people. And the Guinness Book of Records in 2010 gave him the distinction of being the man with the world record for being the most prolific executioner ever. So that's his legacy. The next book, And this one is the Bible. This one was published in 2007 by 3 authors: Anna Ciencala, who was an American academic, originally from Poland, of course, Wojciech Materski from Warsaw, and Natalia Lebedeva, a Russian researcher, archivist from the Soviet Russia. And this book is basically the definitive story, which contains 3 parts, which begin with lengthy interpretation essays of narratives of what happened, followed by the translation of key archival documents, including the March 5th, 1940 execution order signed by Stalin. So this book is a gem and the Bible of, I think, Katyn researchers. But it wasn't the first time that the 1940 execution order had been released. The office of the Polish president, Lech Walesa, that received from the office of the Russian president, Yeltsin, the documents in 1992, had them released to the academic community, which immediately published them along with the Polish translations. And then the year later, this document, called Documents of the Genocide, edited by Wojciech Materski, was published in 1993, which contains the wording of the complete execution order. So that's a useful story, but it doesn't have any annotation or interpretative essay within it. The next book in this category is this book from, this one was written in 2010 by Eugenia Maresch in England. It's called Katyn, 1940, The Documentary Evidence of the West's Betrayal. This book is a classic one that has done a lot. She's done a lot of research about what documents, what the reports that the Poles and the British had, and which the Poles had given to the British government, explaining what had happened. This explains what the British knew, and she reveals much of the documentation from the archives, which shows how the British suppressed the information and tried to cover it up while maintaining this open line verdict or this suspended judgment idea and so on. Then after that, there's this one book. This I consider my favorite. If you're going to just read one book about Katyn, I believe my recommendation is to read this one by Alan Paul. Alan Paul was an American who found out about the Katyn story while studying, and he, in 1991, published the first edition of this book. It's been a bestseller in Poland. It's been reprinted several times. This is the 2010 version, which is updated and reflects much of the information coming from the Ciencala book of 2007. So this is a comprehensive history that I found to be refreshingly well written. And it also provides 3 stories of 3 families and how the massacre and the subsequent events affected them. So this is a very touching book. And of course, in this category, there's one more book, The Murderers of Katyn, which is written by a Russian journalist by the name of Vladimir Abarinov. And of course, this was published first in this one was published, I think it was in 1991 in Russian, and then in 1993 in English. And of course, it challenges the historic Soviet narrative. Now, in terms of political memoirs by politicians, diplomats, and generals, many of the memoirs from the war make references to the Katyn story. And certainly future students should be aware of what was written by people like Winston Churchill or Stanisław Mikołajczyk in his 1948 book, The Rape of Poland, or Polish ambassadors Czechonovsky to the US in his 1948 book, Defeat and Victory, or the Polish ambassador Edward Czapski to Britain in his 1962 book, In Allied London. Even the Soviet ambassador Ivan Maysky in the Maysky Diaries make some references to Katyn. All of these are, of course, relevant, and students should be aware of them. However, the ones that I've chosen to pick and address in this books are three. First, General Władysław Anders and his book, An Army in Exile, The Story of the Second Polish Corps. This was published in 1949. I have a more recent edition that was published in the United States. And this book is really a classic and a gem, and I think every person of Polish background, certainly, and anybody who's interested in this part of Polish history should read it. It has several chapters, of course, and passages that deal with the Katyn story, and there are some passages that are recounted in other books, but this one provides, of course, the original. For example, when it was December 3rd, 1941, General Anders with President Sikorsky and Ambassador Kot met in the Kremlin with Stalin and Molotov. And during the discussions, one of the questions was, where are the Polish officers? To which the story is recounted here. Stalin replied that they were released. They must have escaped. And when Stalin was asked, well, escape where to? He said, Manchuria. And so this was just an example of how the Soviets, even at the highest levels, were playing a deceitful game that bordered on occasion on absurdity. And Anders also created this documentation center, which I believe is one of the truly undervalued or certainly not given the kind of attention that it deserves. And hopefully, perhaps some future students will undertake a study of what this documentation center actually compiled and produced, because I believe it compares to a certain degree, an analogy, the importance of documenting things that happen as they happen. With one can compare it to the Emanuel Ringelblum Aneg Sabat efforts to record what was going on in the Warsaw Ghetto during the war. There the documents about what the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were suffering were put into containers that were buried, and two of them out of the three have been found, and of course have revealed a tremendous trove of treasure of descriptions of how life was in the last period before these people were sent to Treblinka. So I understand that much of the documentation collected by the Anders Documentation Center is either in the Sikorsky Museum or in the Hoover Institution, but some sort of book by future students, I think, would be, or historians, would be very interesting about what was compiled there. Now, one of the things Anders did, of course, was ask Joseph Czapski, a junior officer, to do some research on his behalf and searching for the missing prisoners, and we'll get to that in a minute. Another book, very important and relevant, is that of General Tadeusz Komorowski, who was the head of the Polish Armia Krajowa, which was the underground. And in this book, half of which at the end discusses the tragedy of the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, there is in the first half a discussion in several pages of what happened when Katyn was uncovered by the Germans in 43. And he managed to have an observer sent to the exhumations. And when the observer came back with a number of things, including some of the diaries, Komorowski concludes by saying that those gave him no doubt as to who was responsible for the mass murders. Now, the next book in this, and the last one in this category, is the book by Ambassador Stanisław Kot called Conversations with the Kremlin and Dispatches from Russia. Kot didn't actually speak Russian, so every time he had meetings with Wyszynski or Molotov or Stalin, he always brought a secretary who was a translator, and afterwards they took notes about what was said. So apart from the introduction that he wrote, the rest is just reports that were written immediately after the meetings. And some of these are phenomenal. I mean, one of the examples he gives of a meeting in before the arrival of Sikorsky, he met with Stalin and Molotov and raised the question again of where are the Polish officers. Stalin engaged in some theatrics this time. He went to a telephone and he called somebody and said, I've got the Polish ambassador here. He says the Polish prisoners were not released. Where are they? And he hung up the phone. Later, the phone rang. Stalin went back to the phone and came back and said, mumbling under his breath, that he says they've been released. Now, Kot understood that it was important to push the matter, but not to push in such a way that it was obvious there was going to be no cooperation. So unfortunately, at that moment, he didn't push further because there was no point. It was clear that there was no answer forthcoming. So these are all indicative of the behavior of stalling and deceit coming from the Soviets. Now, the next category, and I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed this up here, is Memoirs of the Former Prisoners. So we've got Joseph Czapski. This was originally published in Polish in 1944 called Memoirs of Starobielsk. It was subsequently published in French, and I used the French version in my annotation. However, an English version is about to be published. It was supposed to be published this month. I've now been informed it's going to be coming out in March. He also wrote another one called The Inhuman Land. And this one was originally published in 1951 and republished by the New York NYRB, Review of Books. And these are the people who are also republishing the Memories of Starobielsk book of Czapski. Czapski tells a number of stories about how he contacted the head of the Gulag, a general in the NKVD, searching for the missing prisoners, and was given the runaround. There are several other books by survivors who were either sent to Gryazovets or to the Gulag. One was from the same camp as Czapski and my grandfather, Bronisław Młynarski, called The 79th Survivor. And he tells also some interesting stories about his interrogation. Another is Memoirs of a Prisoner of War in Kozielsk by the Reverend Monsignor Zdzisław Peszkowski. Now, this was an interesting story of a young officer who survived, was sent to Gryazovets, and then became a priest and visited Katyn several times before he eventually passed away. There's also this one for another survivor from Kozielsk by the name The Road to Katyn by Solomon Strowis. Now, he was a medical officer, and he provides a very interesting perspective from the Jewish perspective, because of all the 15,000 who were murdered from the three camps, apparently approximately 1,000 were Jewish. And he ended up receiving a number of citations, of honorable citations for his performance during the campaign in Italy. But the most interesting one I found is this English edition of Stanisław Słaniewicz's book, In the Shadow of Katyn. It was originally published in Polish in 1976, and his son Witold translated it. This was published in 2002. Słaniewicz's story is one of being in the camp, taken one day to the Gnezdovo train station, about to be loaded onto one of the Black Raven backed out buses to the murder site and to be executed and buried in the forest. When at the last minute, he was taken out of the contingent. It turned out he had studied Nazi and Soviet economics before the war, and the Soviet NKVD headquarters wanted to interview him more and interrogate him more about what he knew about the Nazi economy, but also they suspected him of being a spy and wanted to find out more. So he was saved, but in the process, he managed to observe what happened to his comrades who disappeared. And he wrote about that. Now, the next section, I only have a few minutes left, so I'll try to speed things up. This is the witnesses to the exhumations. One of them was Joseph Mackiewicz that I already referred to. Another one is this one, Russia at War by Alexander Werth. Now, this book, he was a British BBC correspondent. His mother was British, his father was Russian, so he spoke Russian, and he was among the delegation of journalists that the Russians brought to see the Burdenko Commission do its exhumation fraudulent work. And in this book about Russia at War, which is almost 1,000 pages, he's got about 6 pages discussing that particular trip. Now, he says that afterwards, of course, the journalists couldn't really write what they thought because of the Soviet censorship. But he does conclude that the evidence was pretty thin. Now, one of the other ones that's fascinating, which wasn't mentioned in Jabodziński's book, is One Man's War by Frank Stroobant. So he was a British civilian from the Guernsey Islands who was taken by the Nazis, when they occupied the Channel Islands. And he was taken to a prisoner of war camp and was among those who were part of this delegation to the exhumations. And the Nazis wanted him and the others to engage in anti-Soviet propaganda. So he's, after the war, wrote this memoir, and several chapters are about this experience and what he saw. Then there are 2 other books dealing with this question of the witnesses and what they saw. One is this book by Krystyna Piotrkowska, English-Speaking Witnesses to Katyn. This book is published in English and in Polish. I got it at the bookstore at the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw, and Krystyna Piotrkowska did a phenomenal job of trying to identify and track down what was recorded by the English-speaking witnesses who went to Katyn. In the process, she discovered that the British Foreign Office had in fact stymied 3 of the witnesses from appearing as and to give testimony to the Madden committee. A more recent book on a similar topic is this one, Encounter with Katyn, the wartime and post-war stories of Poles who saw the Katyn site in 1943. This book is about the author identified about 60 Poles who went to Katyn and describes the stories of what happened to a couple of dozen of them. And basically, they were hounded by the Nazis upon their return to do propaganda, and then they were hounded by the Soviets afterwards to shut them up. So a couple of them managed to escape, but otherwise they had a very difficult life. Now, before I am told that I'm out of time, there's a couple of more books that I just want to absolutely mention. One is this the issue of aerial photography. And this text, this book that was published by the Polish Geographic Institute, it's also in English and in Polish. And it's a study done by Wacław Maliszewski, who lives in the United States and who has a Facebook group for anybody who's interested in getting a copy of it. It's available online, and this Facebook group of called, I think, Katyn and Stalin, Sites of Stalin's Crimes, has the link to where it can be obtained. But basically, the Luftwaffe conducted numerous sorties for reconnaissance purposes and aerial photography over the Katyn site, which were captured, of course, or received, fell into the hands of the Western Allies. And what Mr. Gadzemba Maliszewski did was examine those and further determined, Russian culpability. It provided more photographic evidence of the cumulative evidence of Soviet guilt. And he also identified a location where he believes the actual executions took place. And that his study and research was also elaborated on in another book by Frank Fox called God's Eye, Aerial Photography in the Katyn Massacre. Now, the next section I just want to touch upon very quickly is that of the families. One book that's a classic, and this one is When God Looked the Other Way, The Odyssey of War, Exile, and Redemption by Wesley Adamczyk. So his father, I believe he was at Starobielsk, murdered like my grandfather. And years later, his mother died. They were deported to Kazakhstan, and as they left, she succumbed to general exhaustion. And so he was left an orphan as a result of this Katyn experience, moved to the States. And eventually when the Piatichatsky cemetery was opened, he was among the delegates visiting. And I think that's a very moving story. Also, Teresa Kaczorowska wrote this book called Children of the Katyn Massacre, in which she interviewed 18 people whose parents disappeared in the Katyn Massacre. Now, there's also one unique book written in history about the Katyn story by Tadeusz Witlin. This was called Time Stopped at 6:30, which is a famous line from the diary of Adam Skolsky. Solsky. It's the untold story of the Katyn Massacre. Now, this book is based on much of the testimony given at the Madden committee. He attended the hearings, but there are some parts where he reconstructs what he envisions was, or imagines was, the dialogue between some of the characters. And that element may be, for some people, a little bit too much reconstruction, but it's all faithful to the original known documentation. And I think this would have made an excellent script for a movie. Now, there's a number of other books that I have referred to in the section on miscellaneous, but in the interest of time, I'll skip over that section. Let me just conclude by saying my top recommendations are from before the Soviet admission, the books by Zawodny and The Crime of Katyn, Facts and Documents. From after the Soviet admission, the book by Sanford and Ciencala, Lebedeva and Matersky. But like I said before, if you only have time for one book, I recommend Katyn, The Triumph of Truth by Alan Paul. So that's it from me. I think I'm right at the edge of the limit of time. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the story.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Kavchik. So we're about out of time, but we'll take two questions real quick. The first question, what happened to the men the officers commanded? Where did they go after they were captured?
What happened to?
What happened to the men the officers commanded? Where did they go after they were
Oh,
captured?
okay. My understanding is that of the 250,000 that were captured, the rank and file were, they went through, uh, some were released, some were imprisoned, and yeah, that's all I generally speaking can say. I don't have specific numbers about how many were released to go home, or how many were kept. But yeah, generally speaking, the lower ranking, privates and recruits and so on, my understanding is that many of them were released and sent home.
Great. And the last question, has this impacted Russian-Polish relations to this day?
Absolutely. You know, in a nutshell, the thing is that, for 50 years, the Soviets pursued a lie, and it was a terrible lie. And after that, although there was a statement of initial, I can't remember the exact word, but it's something like a regret and, blaming it on Stalinism. There was no official um, apology, followed by, as in the case of the Holocaust, for example, some justice in the form of prosecution of the responsible, or even just symbolic compensation. There's no, there's, in one of the books, unfortunately, I didn't have time to get to, but its basic theme was precisely this, that there's still something, the Soviets haven't yet fully released all the information regarding Katyn that was accumulated in their investigations. This matter was the subject of the Human Rights Tribunal complaint to the international, the EU Human Rights Tribunal in the 2012 case of Yanovets. And yeah, it's still, in a sense, a festering wound that does not, you know, completely heal, in part because the Soviets haven't, or the Russians today, haven't been 100% forthcoming with the information that they have.
We have one more question that I'm going to ask real quick. What topics do you think need to be further addressed in the Katyn lecture?
Yeah,
Literature. Sorry about that.
That's a very interesting question. I already mentioned, my thinking that this issue of the documentation center and what it accumulated and what it itself could tell us is something that I think some historians should discuss. But in terms of the Katyn massacre itself, I think that the main concern of many archivists and historians is that there are still, there was a brief period of time when the Russian archives were opened up, and digging the relevant information out was a challenge. But before everybody who was interested could satisfy themselves that they had exhausted all of the avenues of research, I'm under the impression that the archives were closed. And certainly under the current administration in the Kremlin, one gets the impression that digging up such information is not something of interest. And so those are, I think the still outstanding points that should, at some point in history and in the future, be divulged.
Well, it looks like we're out of time. I would like to thank Mr. Kavchik for joining us this evening, and all of you who tuned in here on Zoom and Facebook. If you're interested in attending other upcoming webinar events, supporting IWP, or applying to one of our graduate programs, please go to iwp.edu. Again, that's iwp.edu. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you, Mr. Kavchik.